Welcome back to another web development video where I'll show you how to make modern websites using HTML5, CSS3, and a little bit of JavaScript. In this video, I'm going to continue our web development basics in Webflow series by showing you CSS Grid. So there are two layout tools that have completely changed the way that we can lay out all of our elements on the web. One is Flexbox, which came first. And then the other is CSS Grid, which landed 2017, 2018, something like that, in browsers. And what CSS Grid allows us to do is to create a true grid structure that we can control simply with CSS without having to use any sort of floats, or like we were using different tools to make things look like a grid. But they weren't actually a grid on the page. We were just sort of simulating a grid. So we have more control. There are less hacky things that we have to do with CSS Grid, and it gives us a lot of control, especially in responsive design at different breakpoints, to absolutely control what happens with our grid elements. So I'm going to use, in our main section, I just placed a few 4 photos here. And what I want to do is I want to turn this into a grid that changes at different viewport widths. So what we need to do first is these elements are all just inside of main. What I want to do is wrap these in something. I want to wrap them in a sort of a container, and this is going to be our grid. Now, wrapping these elements in a container is, we could use a section if we wanted to, but this is actually a really good instance where you could use a div. And so we're just going to take a regular old div block, and we're going to insert it in here, and then we're going to take all 4 of these. So I'm just holding down, oh, it won't let me do that, huh? So I can't do multiple images, so I'm just going to do them one at a time, and I'm just going to move them right into this div block. Just like this. They're all the same image, so it doesn't really matter what the order is. So we're just going to put them inside this. And then our div block, we're going to give it a class of image grid. You could also give it a subclass of like for cross or something like that. So if you have lots of different image grids, but you want them to sort of be different variants, you could do that as well. We only have one so far on the page. I'm going to get rid of this background because I think it's a little, too much. Okay, so now we can just focus on this section here. That goes back to its original somewhere along the way, something like that. So you can see inside here we have our image grid, and then we have these what we're going to call the children. So this is the parent, and then inside that element is the children. Main is the parent, and then heading 2 and image grid, these are the children. So they're the direct descendants if you think of this as a family tree. So the things that are inside of an element are its children, and the things that are inside those children are the grandchildren, etc. So sometimes you hear that terminology, oh, that's the parent element, or that's the child element. That's what people are talking about. So each of these can be an element that adheres to our grid. So let's just click on our grid, image grid. And up here in the display, we have display flex, which is Flexbox. And then the one right next to it is to display it as grid. And so we're just going to click that. And automatically it creates a 2-column by 2-row grid. So a 2-by-2 grid. And if we were to just do that, you can see that already we have a grid created, which is mostly what we want, actually. In fact, if we come into these elements and we take their max width, and we, instead of 200 pixels, we say something like 100%, then all of our all of our images actually lay themselves out on the grid. Now there's lots of different things that we can do with the grid. If I double click the grid, it'll open up some of these options. And let me just walk through what you can do with CSS Grid. So right now we have the same amount of space. The columns are what's called 1FR, and 1FR just says from the left side of the grid to the right side of the grid, it's going to lay out as many columns as we tell it. And right now it says 2 columns over here, and that's how many columns we have. It says 2 explicit rows, and that's what we have. So it's laying them out to take 1FR says 1 fractional unit. It takes up as much space as is necessary to fill this column. So from here to here, we have 2 columns. So it's going to use all the space. It's going to create 2 columns, and then it's going to use all the space in between them. So essentially it's creating one column with 50% and another column with 50%. If we were to add another column, that is 3 columns now, all at 1FR, and it doesn't matter what size our screen is. You can see it's always trying to fill those 3 columns across. So if we go down even to a smaller size, it's always trying to fill those 3 columns across. So this is basically sort of 100%. Each column is going to take up, if there are 3 columns, it's going to take up 33% for each column, minus whatever the gutter is here. So a fractional unit is an interesting unit. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but in most instances, it just means take up all the available space left over. Okay, that's if all of the units, if all 3 columns are 1FR, then take up as much space as you need to put 3 columns here and make them equal. So that's what it's going to do. But let me show you. If we go in here, we can actually change that by clicking up here. You can see there's a little arrow, and you can click on that. Now the default is for everything to sort of auto fit and be a flexible unit, the 1FR unit. You can actually change that, and so if you make that 2FR, now it's going to take up twice as much space as it should. So we have a 3 column layout. Now this is essentially taking up 1.5 columns as compared to 1FR, and this is essentially taking up 0.75. So it still equals 3 columns. It's just that this one is taking up twice as much space as these are. So they're sort of in relation to each other. If we eliminate one column, which we can do over here in the panel, you can either duplicate it and create another one, or you can click on the little trash can and get rid of a unit. So if we have a 2 column layout and one side is 2FR and one side is 1FR, this is essentially a 2/3, 1/3 layout. So we have 3 columns, so you can still think of it as 1 column, 2 columns, 3 columns. But this one is taking up essentially the space of 2 columns, and this is taking up the space of 1 column, or it's splitting it up into a 2/3 sort of ratio. So it is a little tricky to play with, but you see that it happens on both of these rows because our columns are connected. This is a grid after all, so our columns are connected. So as we make changes in one space or overall in the grid, it's going to change everything. And we can do the same thing for these rows. So the default for the row is auto. I don't think changing 1FR or anything is going to change that. We won't get into grid areas, but you can also change the gap here, and this changes this number here. So the grid gap is the space between the cells in your grid. You have the option to change the column gap, which is between the columns, or you can change the row gap, which is between the rows. You can do them independently of one another so that they're not the same, or you can lock the two so that when you make changes, let's see, you can make a change, let's say like this, you want to put it at 100 pixels and you want to lock that and make sure that it's 100 pixels in the column and the row. You just click the little lock button and it essentially is going to make them equal to one another. It looks like whenever you make a change right here, that it's going to change it here, but if you want them to be the same, you can lock them together. The row and column doesn't really make any sense for us right now, but essentially when the grid lays things out, it starts top left and goes to top right, and then when it meets the end of the number of columns, it automatically takes the next child element and puts it on the next row down, on the left, to the right, to the left, to the right, to the left, to the right, all the way down until there are no more elements left. So that even if we do create more explicit rows like this, nothing gets filled into them, because remember, we only have four elements here, 4 children of the grid. So doing that doesn't make that much sense for us to put extra rows. Grid will automatically include rows, so that if we got rid of all these, if we got rid of all these rows and now we only have 1 row, it's actually going to lay it out anyway, because we have 4 children in the grid. So this is what we call implicit rows. Whenever you actually make a row, and now we have 2 rows here for our 2 column 2 row grid, that's called an explicit row or an explicit column. But if you want to change the way that things are laid out in your grid, let's say you want this one to be first, but you want this one to be second, and then third, fourth, then that's where you would change the column. Again, it's the same image, so we're not going to see any difference there. But essentially, this is the first image, second image, third image, fourth image, because it's going in a column fashion. Now it's laying them out in columns, not rows. So that is the default. And maybe we can do a more do some other videos with some more complex grids to them. I'm not prepared for that in this particular video, but we can also give these explicit sizes. So we can say, let's say 200 pixels. So now this column, the first column is 200 pixels, while the second column is 1FR. So remember, 1FR takes up whatever space is available, whatever is left. Let's just make this 16 pixels essentially. And you can see here that this takes up 200 pixels, and no more, no less. And then this one takes up all the rest of the space in the grid, which is 1FR. So it's sort of 100% of whatever's left over. If we were to make this also 400% or 400 pixels, then you can see that our grid just shrinks down to whatever the sizes are that we want to fit in there. And we can just as easily come over and change this back to 1 rem. Not 1 rem, 1FR, sorry. And then our grid expands again to the edge of the container, and this takes up 200 or 400 pixels, and this takes up 100 pixels. So there are times when you want this to be a certain size. For this one, there's also something called minimum, maximum, min-max. Min-max means the minimum size that it should be is, and then the maximum size that it should be is. So the minimum size should be, let's say, 200 pixels. This sort of gives you a flexible way to treat the grid. And then the maximum size should be 1 FR. And we can see this as we move here. So the minimum size, you can see it's reached its minimum size of 210 pixels. And this one over here, that is the more flexible unit, the 1 FR, is actually shrinking. You can see it's squishing and shrinking. This one is remaining the same because this column will never go below 210 pixels. That'll be the minimum width that this column needs to be. But it will begin to stretch when it gets past 200 pixels. So you can see that it's acting as a 1 FR right now because it's moving at the same rate. It's growing at the same rate as this 1 FR. So this is really good. Like if you have a column that you need an expressed amount of space for this. It won't just keep devolving and shrinking forever, which is what you see with this. It'll just shrink forever until you get down to nothing and you can't see it. But this one will always retain at least 210 pixels. But it also has the freedom at a larger size to continue to expand and get bigger, just like this size does. So that's using the min-max or minimum maximum. And you do that here, so you just adjust the minimum. You can use lots of different units here for that. And you can use lots of different units for the maximum as well. What else to do with grid? Grid areas, I'm not going to really touch on. I don't use those very much, but it's essentially laying out designated areas for things to go into, and then you can sort of place things in those designated areas. The last thing that I will touch on is when you click on a child element, you can decide on its position. So you can just let the grid lay it out like this if you want to, or well, there's some alignment options too, so it won't, if we do a minimum, let's see, they're all 100 pixels, so you can see inside of our image grid, we have sort of this, this is our grid column and our grid row. So grid column 1, grid row 1. It goes and extends out because our image is only taking up a portion of it, but because it goes the width of the page, it has all of the space. So we can actually go to our image grid and we can decide how things are aligned on the grid. I'll get back up to the placing them on the grid in just a moment. But we can make everything align vertically to the center. So align is vertical alignment. Distribute, I think they're using this to be okay. These are a little confusing. So distribute does things on 2 different levels, maybe. I'm not sure what distribute means. But I know that align is here, so that's going to be your vertical alignment, and this is going to be your horizontal alignment. So if we want all the items in the grid to go to the center, we can choose this centering or to the end, or we can have them take up all the space, which because they have an expressed width on each individual child item, then it's not actually going to take up all the space because there's no way for it to do that. And then again, you can justify items along the baseline, which is not used particularly common. But if our image grid had an expressed height, let's say of 50 viewport heights, and we wanted to place all of these, I think we'd have to do our our child items. Okay, so that's where the distribution would come into play. You can do, this is sort of like a space between with justify on Flexbox. This will be stretching, centering inside of each. So we're affecting all of the different elements in the grid by playing around with some of these values here. This one you're going to get a little bit more because this is our vertical alignment. Or horizontal alignment's not going to do very much for us because the images are not very big. So that's playing around with some of these values that affect every single element on the grid. That's when you click on the grid, you get all these, what are they called? All of these alignments that you can apply to all of the children of the grid. Now let's say we just want one one item to be somewhere specific. So now it's in the top left, but we want that item to be bottom left. We can click on the actual child item and we can go to our alignment tools here. So there's some specific alignments that we can use for each individual item as well as all of the items together. So we can actually place it at the bottom, which is called end, and you can align it to the bottom so that now it sort of breaks out as a child element to the bottom of its particular container, which you can see the container here. This one has a container, this one has a container, so it's just sort of, you can't really see it unless you put a background on it or something, but that's what the container is, and it can move around in any places inside this. So you can move it to the end, you can center it, that would be centering horizontally and that would be centering vertically. So you can actually center all of these elements inside of its own cell. We can't really see the ordering, but you actually are able to order these elements. If they were different, you can make one to go first or last or whatever, and that could happen at a breakpoint. So let's say at desktop levels you want one to be the first up here, but on mobile you want this one to be last. You could set that ordering here without having to change it in the source order here, which is the power of CSS Grid, is that we can lay out all of our images the way that we want to in the HTML, or all of our children, and visually we can make changes whenever we want to at any breakpoint and for any reason. Let me see. Okay. Making things span different columns. So if you're familiar with tables, this is sort of a common thing with tables, is that you can make them span different sizes or different cells. So let's say we want this one to span actually these two columns, but only in this row. So right now it's in column 1 and it's in row 1. But if we click on manual, we can see that there's a column to start and a column to end. Now we wanted to start in column 1 and go to column 2. Okay, and so you can see that now our image has taken up both of these columns, and consequently it's pushed down these elements. So this is the second element, the third, the fourth, and it's pushed them down, and our implicit grid has created a whole new row that we have not explicitly put into we haven't explicitly put that into our grid. We still only have two rows that we're explicitly saying we want 2 rows at least, but it's pushed it down to a third row, and it tells you now that there are 2 rows, but 1 row has been auto-generated. So you can see that it's clear, and it tells you over here that it's auto-generated, so there's no explicit values here. There's an explicit value in these dark pink areas. So it's pushed everything down one row and then down one row again. And this is taking up actually 2 rows. Otherwise, if it wasn't, then it would be, the second item would be here, the third, the fourth. So this is a pretty powerful tool to be able to place things where you want them to be. If you were to say, let's say you also wanted it to take up not only these 2 columns, but these 2 rows. So it would take up all this space here. Then you would just put a 2 here. So it starts in column 1 and it ends in column 2. It starts in row 1 and it ends in row 2. And so now you see that it's taken up 2, this one image is taking up 2 columns and 2 rows, which has pushed everything down farther again. So now this is on row 3, and this is row 3, and this has created a whole new row, row 4. And again, we have 2 rows. These 2 rows are auto-generated, and these 2 rows are explicit. So that's generally how CSS Grid works, and you can use these to place them wherever you want to. If you want to take this item and instead of starting it in column 1, you want it to go and start in column 2. And instead of row 1, you want it to start in row 2. Then now our image actually is explicitly placed here in this bottom right corner, and everything else just sort of fills in and flows around it. So this is actually image number 2. So you can see this is image 2. This is image 1 now. And image 2, image 3, image 4. So as long as there's space for the grid to lay them out, it will actually lay them out on the grid. Because it's like, it's sort of like putting a large rock into a stream or into a river, and then you've sort of set something solid there, and then the river will flow around it. So that's what happens with the grid. You can think of it as a rock. So you can think of it as sort of a rock inside of a stream. Once you place these items, everything else is going to have to sort of flow around it. And that's a place where you can get into using the dense properties and some other sort of more complex, I guess, grid attributes. But to me, this is sort of the basics of using CSS Grid, and then there's a lot of things that you can do with it as far as applications. You don't have to use it expressly for an image grid only. You could use it for this up here, where you have a logo on one side and a navigation on the other side. It would just be a 2-column grid, and then you have a little bit more control over the way that things are laid out, especially on mobile sizes and things like that. But I'm trying to think if there's anything else. You can actually apply spacing to the grid just like any other element. So let's try. So you can apply margin, and this would push it from the side of the main element. You can give it a background color like this, and then that would color the entire grid. And you can see that this is our grid now. It's got margin on either side, and it's got a background color. And then each of these individual grid items can also have its own background color, but it's not gonna do very much because it's an image, so it's not gonna do too much there. But each cell can have its own background color and things like that. So there's lots of fun things that you can do. I actually have a playlist for learning CSS Grid, and then I've got a playlist that just has a bunch of grid things that I've done. I've been working on CSS Grid since probably 6 months before it became an actual spec. You had to use like the production version of Chrome to be able to see it. So now everyone is caught up. I think it's at 97 or 98% of all browsers have CSS Grid in it, so it's something that we can use for production websites. You don't have to be afraid of it. And I like how Webflow has implemented CSS Grid. It makes it easy to do some things, and a lot easier to see what's happening inside the grid just by clicking on, you know, all of these different alignment tools here. You have to just kind of know what's going to happen when you're writing the code by hand, but you can actually see it visually sort of take shape before your eyes. So this is a really cool tool. You can use it for small parts like this. You can use it for very small parts, or you can use it to shape your entire layout. So it just depends on what you're trying to do. CSS Grid works all over inside containers as its own container. It doesn't matter. And like I said, it's fully responsive. So if you get down to sort of a smaller size here, and we click on our grid, then you can make your grid. What have we done? We've done the height. You can just make that auto. So now it shrinks up a little bit. We can take away all the margin. So now it fits onto our page nicely. And we can even make this a single column. So if we edit the grid and we get rid of one of our columns, and let's see if that works. Oh, it won't work because we've explicitly put this one somewhere. So we say auto. This one, what have we done here? No alignment. Okay. So now we can lay out our grid at this size as sort of one on each line, one column layout. But then when we get here, we still get our 2-column layout. So we can see how we can change the grid as we go along, and it will shift into our 1-column layout once it gets to this size here, which is, you know, 475 pixels or so, and then it'll shift to our 2-column grid. So we can do lots of cool things with CSS Grid. This is sort of the default when you're doing the desktop view. All right, if you have any questions or concerns, anything that wasn't very clear, please leave them in the comments section below, and I'll get to them as quickly as I can. Hopefully this gives you a better idea of how you can use CSS Grid. It's a super powerful tool. This is like total basics about how to use it inside of Webflow, but hopefully in later videos we'll do some more projects where we'll actually integrate Grid and Flexbox together and see how those two things how they can work together to create some really cool layouts and some very flexible types of layouts and solve a lot of problems for layout in the web. If you haven't subscribed, click the subscribe button and then click the bell notification, and you'll get notified whenever I publish new videos. And you can follow me on Twitter at Brian Hafferkamp, and I'd love to connect with you there. And if you want to pay this video forward, all my videos are free. So if you want to pay it forward and you feel like you want to do something to help, clicking the thumbs up button seems like a dinky thing to do, but that actually helps the videos a lot. It helps YouTube to know that this is valuable content. So if you found it valuable, if you think that it's been helpful to you, then click that thumbs up button, and it's super easy to do. All right, I think that's it. I'm going to continue doing this series and thinking about all the different, not just how to do something, like how to use Grid, but how to actually implement it to create different things inside of Webflow. We'll be doing Flexbox at some point too. All right, I think that's all for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.